Welcome to Channel 17, the Town of Colonie Government Channel.
Hello and welcome to Getting to Know You. I'm Robert Jaquay, your host. One of the more interesting positions within the Town of Colonie is that of historian. Today's guest is a current historian, Kevin Franklin. Let's go meet him. Kevin, thank you very much for agreeing to come on the show today.
You're welcome.
Before we get into what it is to be the historian for the Town of Colonie, I just wanted to ask about your background. What brought you to becoming the historian?
I was raised here in Colonie, lifelong town resident. I've always enjoyed history as a topic. Years ago, I spent a lot of time. I grew up in the Latham area, and I spent a lot of time as a kid exploring all the streams and the fields and areas, particularly out in the Bout in the North Colonie area along the Mohawk River. It was wide open space back then, and you could walk through the fields, and you seemed to be going all day long, and the only thing that separated you from another field was maybe a barbed wire fence and some cows.
So you're a bit of an explorer in your youth.
I did some exploring. It was a good thing to be able to pack a peanut butter sandwich and a bottle of soda and a fishing pole, and I was off for the day. And it was a good feeling just to be out there. The only thing between you and the rest of the world was the clouds and nature.
So history is really a hobby or something, a pursuit, a personal interest of yours that you pursued and eventually led you to here.
I grew up in my family. My mother in particular, she had antiques all around her house, and it wasn't unusual for us to go out on a weekend and go antiquing, so to speak. And she would pick up bits and pieces of furniture that she would refinish, and we'd help her refinish the furniture. And every now and then, tucked into an old piece of furniture might be an old letter or a picture and something from the 1800s that would be interesting. And I grew up in a home that was sprinkled with many antiques, and I think that started my love of history.
Now, when you came to Colonie, you became the historian. You were appointed the historian, but you also were a historian in another place before here.
I grew up in a town, and like I say, I attended the North Colonie schools, went to Forts Ferry School, and then eventually graduated from Shaker High. And in 1973, at the ripe old age of 20, I became a police officer in the village of Menands. And in 1974, as a matter of fact, the village was celebrating its 50th anniversary, and the historian at that time was a fellow by the name of Howard Menand, who was the grandson of Louis Menand.
Okay. And
Howard would come into the station, and they were in the process of developing a 50th anniversary party and celebration, and putting together a book. And Howard would come into the police station, and I always managed to find some time to talk to Howard about the history of Menands. My father, consequently, is from Menands. He was born and raised there, and my interest with history just continued on from that point. And in 1986, the historian for Menands was a fellow by the name of Mr. Cotter, I believe his name was, and he had submitted his resignation, and I spoke with the mayor of the village at that time, I believe was Tom Gibbs, and he appointed me as historian, and I began to collect the history of Menands. I was also the photographer for the police department at that time, so I combined my police skills with photography skills and a little bit of love of history, and I was able to amass a collection of material relating to the history of the village. And I was also a member of the Town of Colonie Historical Society.
Okay.
And I had worked with Mrs. Olton, the Town of Colonie historian, for many years. And when Mrs. Olton retired because of health reasons, I had slightly over 30 years of service with the village of Menands, and I approached Supervisor Brazel and talked about my interest in possibly becoming historian for the town, and they took me on in the fall of 2003, and I've enjoyed every minute of it ever since.
And here you are.
And here
You
I
are
am.
definitely a welcome addition to the town. The town itself is just filled with history. I mean, and, you know, I'm sure that you could just spend a lot of time, you know, investigating it. What kind of things do you do? Do you look at, I mean, archival stuff? Do you books? Do you go to sites? How do you pursue this?
It's a little bit of everything. Sometimes it's hands-on. When I first took over as historian, the town conservation officer, Paul Russell, took me to some of the areas of the town. The town is, you know, it's quite large, as you know. It's nearly 60 square miles, and there was a lot of the town that you know, I was not really too familiar with, and Paul you know, brought me around. And one of the things that he showed me were the locations of the many cemeteries in the town. And part of what I do is interacting with the other factions in town government, you know, planning, the building department, anybody who has a question about town history. Environmental studies, I get questions, emails, for instance, about the history of a certain property. Sometimes there's quite a bit of history on the property, and other times what I have is very, very sparse. But generally, what I do, what happens on a daily basis is I learn something as well, and that contributes to the overall you know, history of the town.
Do you ever get in front of a project and say, you can't dig there, you can't do that, this is a historical site?
No, not so much. Not so much that. I'm sure that something like that can happen. There's you know, whenever there's a new building is going to be put up, part of the process includes an environmental review, and part of that environmental review is the history of the proper, any known history. And part of my job is to tell the developer or the building department what the particular history of a site is. And we have, you know, many properties here in the town that are on the National Register, and some that could be on the National Register. Many years ago, a historic survey was conducted back in the 1980s of the entire town, and some people chose not to have their properties put on the historic register. But there are many structures in the town that certainly may requalify to be put on the historic register. My job would be to advise more than anything else as to the historic properties of a structure or a ground or whatever.
Are there any surprises? I mean, are you discovering new things, you know, all the while? Or?
There have been some surprises. You know, most recently we We literally stumbled upon a cemetery down off across from the Schuyler Flats. It turned out to be a cemetery of African descent. Probably 12, 13 individuals buried there. That's something that's ongoing. We're investigating that along with the New York State Museum. But it's not the first time that an unknown cemetery has been discovered in the town. And usually, when there's some type of a project, whether it be the water department, putting another line in. I think several years back, another colonial cemetery was found off Console Road. 8 or 9 people, maybe not that many, 5, 6 people were discovered, and those remains were eventually transferred to the Albany Rural Cemetery, which is another fantastic asset for the town.
Now you work with is there an association with Albany Rural, Friends of Albany Rural, right?
There is a Friends of Albany Rural Cemetery. I work with the Friends of Albany Rural Cemetery. I'm on a planning committee on their board down there. I also am involved with the Town of Colonie Historical Society, Board of Directors of Prine House, the Mohawk Towpath Byway Association. There's a lot of different things that intertwine with my duties as historian.
A lot of activity. Now you mentioned the Historical Society. How long has that been around?
They were chartered in 1971 by Mrs. Olton and different members of the Historical Society at that time. There was a tremendous amount of interest in the mid-1970s, as you know, with the bicentennial for 1976. And a lot of interest and a lot of activity within the Historical Society and the town itself. There was a bicentennial commission. A lot of events took place. The town published a pictorial history of Colonie. That had a second publication, I think, in the 1980s. Okay. There's only a handful of them left. I have to sit down and have a conversation, I think, with the town board to maybe think about having that reprinted or update that. The last printing of the pictorial history of the town covers the Dutch colonial period from when Henry Hudson sailed up the river, or even before that, up until about 1900. But I think what we need to do is cover the century between 1900 and 2000. There's been just a tremendous amount of growth in the town during that period of time, and there's a lot of loose ends that need to be gathered so far as the town's history.
So would the Historical Society actually help
Absolutely.
promote this?
We've seen a resurgence in interest in the Historical Society. We picked up some new members here in the last couple of years. A lot of the members who were very active in the 1970s, sadly some of them are no longer with us anymore, and some have rotated through the Historical Society, taking positions as secretary, treasurer, and corresponding secretary and president and whatever, and have gone back just to becoming just members instead of sitting on the board of directors of the Historical Society. But the Historical Society was very active years ago. Probably played a critical part in the formation of the Prine House, for instance.
Okay.
Many of the original members of the Historical Society later became members of the Friends of Prime House, and some have cross memberships to this day.
Now our paths have crossed also in the Prine House.
They have.
And I know you put a lot of energy and time into the Prine House. And I've always found one of the challenges of the Prine House is the historical versus the functionality of it.
Absolutely.
And so, I think it's your task, or has been your task, to make sure that we keep our focus on the historical.
Absolutely. The Prine House is a wonderful place for people in the entire town and other communities actually to come and enjoy. The many concerts that are over there, throughout the summer, different events that are put on by the Prine House. Prine family didn't own the property for the longest period of time, but Casper's Prine was one of the rent collectors for Stephen Van Rensselaer, and the association with the Van Rensselaer estate back in the 1830s and before Stephen Van Rensselaer died in 1839. Certainly brings the historical aspect of the entire area right to the town with the Prine House. Some of the structures that are on the grounds there have always been there. Other structures, such as the Burmaster Barn, were rescued from the Verdoy area along Route 7, along with the Verdoy School was rescued, and both of these buildings were reconstructed and play a critical part in the Prine House and in the history of the town itself.
We'd like to think that everybody knows about the Prine House, but we find out all the time that people don't, so want to invite people there as well.
Absolutely.
One of the things you look at, you go to cemeteries, and you mentioned also that there were a lot of private cemeteries. It's not just Albany rural, they're private cemeteries. And you look at that information from the headstones, I believe, and all that, but you also look at other sources like photos and maps. These are the kind of things that get the information that you're looking for, right?
A lot of the material in my office, there was a fellow who was one of the early members of the Historical Society, was a gentleman by the name of Arthur Johnson. Art Johnson worked very closely with Mrs. Olton. Art Johnson was an archaeologist. He was also a genealogist. He was a photographer of some accomplishment, and he worked very, very hard all during the 1970s and right up into the 1980s to help document a lot of the town's early history, the Dutch colonial history, many of the early names in the town, including the Fondas, Vandenbergs, Whitbecks, a lot of Lansings, a lot of the early Dutch names who were either land owners or land tenants under Stephen Van Rensselaer, under the Van Rensselaers in the West Manor of Rensselaerswyck. And many of the early farms in the 1700s and 1800s, primarily after the Revolutionary War. A lot of land here in what was the Manor of Rensselaerswyck. Farms sprang up, sometimes of 200 or 300 acres, sometimes 100 acres, depending on the size of the farm. The farm would have their own individual family cemetery, and many of these were forgotten, tucked away in various areas of the town. There's probably still some out there that are yet to be discovered. Hopefully not in the middle of another water project, but they are there. And Art Johnson documented these sites. He also documented the genealogical history of the people, including land grants and indentures and deeds, wills, a tremendous amount of work. And when Mr. Johnson passed away, he turned his entire collection of material, a life's collection, over to the Town Historical Society, and they're housed in my office in a fire file.
Okay, I was going to ask you, can people access this kind of information if they came to your office?
Most certainly.
Okay.
Most certainly. The office is open weekdays from roughly 9 o'clock in the morning until 3, 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and off hours would be available on appointment.
Okay.
Including weekends. If somebody can't get there for any other reason except on a weekend, I could make some arrangements to do that. Photocopying is available. Scanning is available. People can come in with their own cameras and photograph documents if they'd like. Many of the early families. It's kind of tough to say exactly how many files are in the office, but mostly all of the history in the town, or a great portion of the history in the town, from the early 1700s right up until about 1900 and beyond.
Fair amount of it.
There's a lot of it.
You also, I would imagine, rely on newspapers as a source for information. Are you into archival work with newspapers, or the newspaper project, or do you rely on the library? How do you work with newspapers?
The newspapers are certainly a source of information. More recently, a lot of material and information can be obtained online. Mm-hmm. The newspapers, the news channels, Times Union, Spotlight, different local papers are always a good source of history. I work with the Albany County Hall of Records down on Tivoli Street, are a wonderful repository for a lot of the early history, land records in particular, and more. The State Library, State Museum, the Office of Parks and Recreation, Historic Preservation, different groups. I interact with other historians.
And you could lead people to those groups too if you felt it would be better.
Sometimes, I may not have information, but I know where information is stored, and I can lead someone, at least point them in a direction. There was one fellow here recently who was doing a lot of investigation of the Stanford family, and what many people may not realize here in Colonie is that Leland Stanford was born, or what we believe he was born, in what was called the Bull's Head Tavern, which sat along the Watervliet Turnpike in what is now the village of Menands. That's subject to further investigation. Some will say we don't think he was born there, but a lot of books that were in print as early as in the early 1930s, dealing with the history of the Stanfords, place Leland Stanford as being born in the Menands area, and of course the family owned inns along the Albany and Schenectady Turnpike, and in later years Leland Stanford would move to California, and he would become what was known as one of the Big Four, mm-hmm. who built the Transcontinental Railroad and also founded Stanford University. There's many names of people here in Colonie, in the Colonie area, that lent to the development of the entire country.
I know a lot of people come to the library, Kevin, and look for genealogical, or start their search here. Would people come to you in order to start a genealogical search, or not necessarily?
They do. There are part of the files are family files. Part of my duties as historian are not necessarily to do genealogical research, but it goes hand in hand. People who have or who are doing a tremendous amount of genealogical research may find their way to my office. And again, what happens is sometimes I learn something, and I share information, and a lot of times people will share that information with me. They'll provide me with a file, and that's one more piece of information that down the road somebody else may find of use. But genealogy is part of what I do, and nearly on a daily
basis.
Not so much a daily basis, but at least on a weekly basis, there are people who either email me or will stop by the office and will ask questions about their early history. As far away as Germany,
really?
I've had emails. Yeah, people have visited the office from Alaska, looking at their early Dutch history. So there's quite a bit to be had.
Clearly fascinating, right?
I find it fascinating, yes.
We're getting close to the end of the program. Is there anything you want to highlight that we might have missed? Anything that's a new project, or anything that you'd like to bring out?
One of the things that, getting back to cemeteries, one of the things that we've been able to do is the restoration of two cemeteries in the last couple of years. One is the Vandenberg Cemetery in the Dutch Meadows development off of Bout Road. Vandenbergs owned a large farm in that area, and the developer helped to restore the cemetery along with local Boy Scouts who made that an Eagle Scout project. And most recently, the Mark Cemetery on the other end of Bout Road in the Manchester Heights development. The developer has been very, very good with us to help take down trees and grind down stumps. Brought in topsoil, and of course the Boy Scouts got in and cut down brush, and we had an extensive restoration project over the course of this summer, working on weekends to restore the cemetery. Most of it was destroyed by vandals over the last 30, 40 years. When Art Johnson looked at the cemetery back in 1975, 1976, some of the stones had been broken or toppled over. But by the time we got to it in 2005 and in 2006, in that span of 30 years, the vandals had just gone in and literally tore the cemetery to pieces. Many of the older, early stones we were not able to put back. They were broken into little pieces like that, and it was impossible to even find all of them.
So part of restoring is hopefully being able to restore the stone if it can be done?
Well, eventually, I don't know so much as restoring the stone itself, but the information that was on the stones is more important, and that's the information that Art Johnson was able to compile. But and he did photograph the stones, so I could have the stones reproduced, but each stone is the better part of $1,000 bill in today's money, so it's quite expensive. Perhaps what I might be able to do would be to put at least a plaque down with the people's names on them that were in the cemetery. But out of about 12 or 13 people that were buried in the Mark Cemetery, I think we were able to restore 7 of the gravestones back to their original condition, or nearly their original condition. And that will be something that once the area is fenced in, there'll be a blacktop path put between the road and the cemetery, and a nice fence around it. It will provide an area or a setting for the people who will eventually live in that development, maybe to just go there someday and sit down and relax and reflect a little bit.
Wow. When I was a young boy growing up, my dad was famous for getting us in the car on a Sunday afternoon and taking us through a ride through the country, and boy, he would point to this and point to that. It sure seems like you'd be a great guy to get in a car with on a Sunday afternoon. I bet you could point out a lot of things.
I tend to jabber when I drive through the town, especially if sometimes I talk to myself.
Well, and if people want to know more about you in the historian's office, they can go to the town website, www.colonie.org/historian. There's also a site for the Historical Society,
Mhm.
I believe. There might be a link from that, and we'll
There
put
is.
that up there as well.
There is.
It was great having you here today. I've learned a lot, and I hope our viewers have too, so thanks again for coming.
Bob, appreciate it. Thank you very much.
And thank you for joining me on another edition of Getting to Know You. I hope you enjoyed the show and will join us next week. Until then, have a great one.